Turo is the world's largest car sharing marketplace, and it's the perfect app for travel.
I was recently traveling overseas for 7 weeks in multiple cities. Turo made it so easy to find the type of car that I needed in each city, including various things like a car seat, snow tires, and a lot of space.
I live in SF, Austin, and Sydney, and I use their cars wherever I am and when I'm traveling. I don't have a car in SF and Austin, and we just use Turo. The booking process is so convenient, and the hosts are awesome. Go to Turo.com and download the app today. Sendar is the OG startup accounting firm in Australia, catering for all stages of your business's life.
If you're busy running your startup, you don't have time to do your own books and forecast. Instead, fully outsource your finance function, giving you time and resources back to focus on what you do best, which is growing your business.
For a free 1-hour consultation about your business's growth plans and finance needs, head to sendar.com. That's SCENDAR.com.
Are you building a SaaS business and looking to achieve compliance with SOC 2 and ISO 27001 or other security and privacy frameworks?
Compliance can unlock major growth and build essential customer trust, but let's face it, it's usually time-consuming and expensive.
And really kind of a pain. That's where Vanta comes in. Vanta automates up to 90% of customer compliance tasks, making you audit ready fast and saving you up to 85% of the associated costs. Plus, Vanta scales with your business, offering a market-leading trust management platform to continuously monitor compliance, unify risk management, and streamline security reviews. Join 7,000 global companies, including Atlassian and Dovetail, that trust Vanta to build and prove their security in real time.
And for our listeners, Vanta is offering 10% off.
Just go to vanta.com/first. That's VANTA.com/first.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. Hey, I'm Cheryl.
I'm Maxine.
This is First Check, part of Day One, the network dedicated to founders, operators, and investors.
If you want to be a better early stage investor, this is the show for you.
So TLDR, if you don't want to suck at investing, listen up. All right. Well, our next guest, I'm so excited. We are going to be talking to Bronwen Clune. What I'm so excited to talk to Bronwen about is just her history of going from media to startups to back to media to back to startups. She's got so many different perspectives.
Totally. I think she is in an information nexus in the startup ecosystem, especially for Australia, that I think is super rare, right? She straddles so many different places. She has so many interesting conversations every single day and is so deep in the ecosystem and actually quite an OG for the ecosystem. She was part of some co-working spaces and communities super early on in the kind of development of the Australian ecosystem. So I'm jazzed to just hear how she thinks it's developed over time. I think because she wordsmiths all day, she's also just a total delight to chat to.
That's so true. But yeah, the also going deep thing, she goes deep on so many interesting topics that I'm always surprised. I learn something every time I read her newsletter. And actually, that's probably another thing. It's one of the things that I actually do read on a regular basis. I sign up to a lot of newsletters, but the Capital Brief is the one that I do read quite regularly. And often I'm wow, you just picked a topic that to me offhandedly would have seemed totally irrelevant. And then talked about it in a deep way and then brought it back to the tech ecosystem, which I just love the way her mind works.
That's the best. I actually cannot wait for this. Let's dive in. All right, let's get into it.
Do it.
I am so excited for this podcast and for this conversation. Today we have Bronwen on with us. Excited to dive in. So we asked the same question for every one of our guests when they join us, which is, what is the first thing you have ever invested in?
Well, probably myself, I would say. My journey into startups was actually when I was working as a journalist a few years ago. This story will age me. But anyway, the internet wasn't quite the thing we have today, but I was kind of very early using the internet. I was working from home, I was freelancing, I had young kids. And I kept saying to everyone in the newsroom, you guys, this changes the game we're in. This is going to change the game we're in. And for a bunch of people that, pride themselves on curiosity, they weren't very curious about what the internet was going to do to our industry. And so I started what was probably one of the earliest citizen journalism news sites in the world at that time.
Wow.
And that actually is where I kind of landed up in my big entry into startups. But that was a 3 years at the helm of something very new at that time. Never made any money, but I still think that was probably, I think of it as a 3-year deep dive into startups. But really was a big investment, I think, in myself and taking that risk at the time.
Oh my God, that's so cool.
That's
I had
so
no
cool.
idea. So can you tell me a little bit more about what was the era that you were doing this? Are we talking like the 90s.com?
So yeah, early 90s.
So cool.
It was around the time Twitter was launched. Reddit and the Reddit was big. And there was, who was their competitor? Dig, Evan Rose, like all these new things were all coming onto the kind of scene where people were kind of like curating news live. And I really looked at it and I was like, this really fundamentally changes how people consume news, but also how we gather news. So Twitter to me was the most amazing thing, especially back in the early days, like just really was in my wheelhouse of interest. So very early on Twitter. And, I think it really did change journalism a lot. Obviously, it's had its own journey. But yeah, that was sort of, the era. Look, back then, the startup scene in Australia, you could probably name the 12 of us. We all knew each other. There was an email list that had Mike Cannon-Brookes and Scott Farquhar on it. Like, there wasn't a lot.
Yeah, wow. That's so cool.
I'm impressed that you even called it that. Like there was even a startup scene back in the early 90s. Like,
oh, it was very little. But we really, even back then, we kind of really punched above our weight. Australians were some of the earliest podcasters. Like, we had a Silicon Beach podcast and, we'd get on to a call with people at that time, like Michael Arrington and, Jason Kalkanis, I think, was on the podcast with us. Like, it was really, the scene was tiny, but, Australians were still doing kind of really impressive stuff back then.
I am forever, and this might sound like a crazy thing to say, but I am forever just amazed by the way that Australians punch above their weight, right? Most recently, I didn't realize Peter Singer was Australian.
Oh, really?
And then he was at Sunrise, and I was like, oh my goodness, think about the impact that man has had. And that's just one. And maybe I'm just unreasonably patriotic, but I just think it's so cool and really impressive the pace at which Australians or the front runners of Australians run and pick up new initiatives and new insights and really run with them. They've done some really cool stuff. And I was already super excited for this, but just I'm wowed by the fact that you were one of those 12 on that email distribution list building early startups.
I know, right? We had this joke at Sunrise where everyone was like, oh yeah, Bronwen, she's OG. And then I was like, oh God, this is starting to make us feel like the veteran elders of the ecosystem. But there are, and a lot of us involved back in that day. There's still a lot of us still involved. A lot of people aren't, but, a lot of us still, I know Ian Gardner and Hayden Stowe. I know Nikki Shabak from back then. I was, at Pollenizer on the day that Nikki closed Blackbird. I worked at Pollenizer with Phil and Nick Levinskas, Phil Moll and Levinskas. And, when Blackbird closed, we didn't really have VC before that. And I remember Mick coming into the office at Pollenizer and saying, hey, we've just started this thing, mate. You guys better come down and let's just talk to them about everything we know. We didn't really know that much either. But, it was very early. It was a very fun time to be involved in the scene.
That's so cool.
But that's kind of where I got involved in the scene. Yeah.
That's awesome.
I do think starting a company, regardless of the nature of the business that you build, right, is an investment in yourself. I've seen it time and time again, just the pace of development, both skill set, knowledge, but also personal development stuff. I just don't think that there is a better investment in personal development than starting a company. Stepping onto the field and doing a really, really hard thing, you just have to learn so much about yourself. So what was your journey back from that startup back into journalism? Well, I guess you stayed in journalism, but back into a different form of it.
No, I actually stayed in startups. I worked in startups while I worked in Pollenizer. Yeah, no, I've actually worked more in startups than I have in journalism. So journalism is my first love. I created a startup because I really felt like news needed to get this right. Unfortunately, the trajectory of that industry has not been great. We landed up chasing eyeballs. it became about, wanting hits over integrity of journalism. But fundamentally, I still think the thing that journalism has to sell back right now is the basics of journalism. So I think we've done this big kind of journey. My journey was really, until this job, I'd worked in startups, most recently for LaunchVic, which is a Victorian government agency. But prior to that, I was also on the founding team of Culture. So I, went to San Francisco with John, one of the founders, and we grew Culture out in the US and also the UK. So, I was employee number 8, I think, at Culture.
Wow.
And then I've always wanted to get back into news because, like I said, I think more journalists should be like startup people and like, what's broken? How can we fix it? And that's always been the question for me about news. It's so broken. We have to find a way for this model to work. And I actually didn't know John McDonnell. I knew of Chris Jansen, didn't know David Eisman, the founders of Capital Brief, but I saw this ad and I was looking for a job, but begrudgingly, because, I'm like a lot of people, you don't want to go work for someone else. But I saw this ad for Capital Brief and I was like, okay, they sound like they kind of get it, but I just don't think 3 guys out of Fairfax, 3 dudes out of Fairfax are never going to really agree with me how they think news needs to change. And when I met them, I was really pleasantly surprised. And, at that stage, I was like, well, I care enough about this to help fix it. So, that's why I'm here in this role. But really fundamentally, I've had more of a career in startups than journalism. I edited Startup Smart, which is now Smart Company, but we had a separate publication on startups as well, just before I joined Culture. And at that stage, startups were still being reported in Australian media as like small businesses. So they threw like franchises and new companies and everything into that startup thing. And I was like, well, that's not really what this word means.
No.
So, maybe we didn't have a big enough industry to sustain it back then, because that would have been 8 years ago now, where now I think, we certainly do. We certainly do. And Capital Brief, it's really our biggest round in a lot of ways, just because there's so much happening.
Yeah. I mean, that's the one that I read.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, actually, I do read Letter of Intent as well. But Capital Brief is the one that I actually read, whereas the others you kind of skim through, get the points. But
yeah.
I think what you've done with Capital Brief is, and so did you not? You started it with them though? Like they pitched it to you, but I've only ever known you as the person who writes for Capital Brief. Like, was there something before and you took over?
No. So it's brand new. We all came together. They hired an amazing group of journalists. We've got a great team. And, the interesting thing is newsrooms are really kind of old school in the way they do things. There's a big hierarchy. There's a lot of ego involved in a newsroom. We've really built something very different. It's very collaborative. We've got a great kind of culture, and I think that's also been a big part of its success.
Why the content is so good.
Yeah, and look, the other thing I think is, we are a startup as well. I think I'm the only person probably in the team who's actually worked in startups. Chris, David and John were part of the team at Fairfax that was originally given the task of go out and tell us how we can make legacy media work. And they essentially looked at each other and were like, I don't think we can do it in legacy media, which is great. But I do think it's interesting that a lot of the conclusions I've come to around what would work as a business model were very similar to the ones they came to. And I also wouldn't have joined. There's no other newsroom I probably would have joined, despite it being something I've always wanted to come back.
Are you building a SaaS business and looking to achieve compliance with SOC 2 and ISO 27001 or other security and privacy frameworks?
Compliance can unlock major growth and build essential customer trust, but let's face it, it's usually time-consuming and expensive.
And really kind of a pain. That's where Vanta comes in. Vanta automates up to 90% of customer compliance tasks, making you audit ready fast and saving you up to 85% of the associated costs. Plus, Vanta scales with your business, offering a market-leading trust management platform to continuously monitor compliance, unify risk management, and streamline security reviews. Join 7,000 global companies, including Atlassian and Dovetail, that trust Vanta to build and prove their security in real time.
And for our listeners, Vanta is offering 10% off.
Just go to vanta.com/first. That's VANTA.com/first.
Yeah, that's super cool.
It's so impactful to have something like Capital Brief in the mix. I mean, this is maybe selfish, but would love to kind of continue that thread and hear, like, what do you think the future of journalism looks like, maybe in Australia and globally, if you have a view there, because it is such an important pillar of a thriving ecosystem, a functioning democracy, happy, well-adjusted people, and it does seem like it is structurally under threat. And so, from someone who has got this incredible interdisciplinary experience and insight, do you have a view on what you think is going to change there, or are you kind of just waiting to see the way it plays out?
I've got so many views, Maxine. I don't know how much time you have. Look, I think we're at a really interesting precipice, and people are very critical of journalism today. And I would probably largely agree with them, because where we've landed up is not where it began. And I think that the fundamentals of journalism in being fair, honest, and transparent in your work are still true. And I do think that the only things we have to sell back, you know, the old model of advertising, kind of advertising was the business model and journalism was the product. You know, it worked when it worked, but it's broken and that is gone. So I do think paying for news, the model of subscriptions, is fundamental. I think it only works for niche news though, like business journalism, people will pay for it. General news, it's harder. But then I also think it's important for institutions like the BBC and the ABC to continue to be funded and for politics not to become part of that. And unfortunately it has. You know, in America, they have a much bigger history of philanthropic support for independent journalism. I think that's also healthy. So when it comes to general news, the model doesn't work. But I do still think, like, phase one is winning back trust of the public. And I think that's going to happen. Like, social media is not what we all thought it was going to be. It's kind of landed up a bit of a mess, hasn't it?
Sure has.
A little bit, but what, you don't think people would want to pay like for 10 ways to lose 10 pounds over the next 10 days? Like,
well, they don't. And that's the issue. It's like, I think journalism sold itself out. Like, essentially, the one commodity it had, it trashed itself. And, you know, I do think there are enough people that care about this. And I think we live in a really complex world, and making sense of it has only become harder in some ways. But I do think there is a role for good journalism to play. I do think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Perfect. That's what I want. Definitely more clickbaity stuff before I get more quality stuff.
That was the prediction I wanted to hear.
But you know, the idea that in journalism, like that, you know, the old school used to be like, get 2 views, you know, make sure you get the yes and the no. And it's like, come on, that is such outdated thinking. There's often many sides to a story. And also there's not a right side to fundamental things like racism or sexism. There's no, oh, let's go get the alternative view on that. Like, I think the idea that journalists don't have values and don't have inherent bias is nonsense. But I think let's operate in a mature way. Unfortunately, you know, social media and the discourse it's brought on has made some of those things more challenging. But I do think it's important enough that we will sort through it.
How do you think about that in terms of, like, I mean, increasingly Capital Brief is, you know, the preeminent business newspaper. As far as I'm aware, it's the one that more people in the startup ecosystem are reading today than even the AFR. I think there's been like a huge erosion of trust between the kind of quality of perspectives in the AFR and the startup ecosystem. And so as you think about, like, choosing the stories that you think are valuable to tell, working out whether like the format of the story as well, like working out whose voices should be heard in a particular story, or is it an opinion piece, or should it be kind of fact-based journal, like fact-based report? Like, how do you even go about that curation, kind of knowing the leverage point that you are in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's hard, and really it depends day to day, because you're not just you're making a news judgment on a day, like how much space do I have today? And we are a small team, so there's a lot we don't and can't report on. More and more, we are making sure that the journalism we report at least is original. So, often there's times I love a story, but it's gone out elsewhere. And we didn't want to do this in the beginning. And it's not a matter of being, oh, well, you gave it to them, so we're not covering it. It's, look, the story's out there elsewhere. Unless I can do something really new, and there hasn't really been one, we won't cover it. But yeah, look, I'm constantly asking like myself that, and particularly, because we all are such a small newsroom, but we brought in more startup resources. So Hugo Mathers, who works in our briefings team, he's increasingly writing more about startups. We're kind of bringing it into more and more of the other rounds. But yeah, there's no perfect answer. I try and make sure I elevate the experience I have. So maybe I can write about things in a way that other journalists can't have. Like, I think, Maxine, I spoke to you very early on. Actually, I spoke to both of you very early on about two trends we saw happening. One was secondaries. The other was, the rise of syndicates. It's just because I've been in the industry so long, I was like, well, look, I can see this change and I can understand why they're happening. And, we wrote that secondary piece. I think it was one of the first pieces we published last July. And it's just proven over and over to be true. So, those are the sorts of questions, I'm asking myself.
I find a lot of what you write about, it feels like it's relevant and directed at me as an investor. And I'm sure that's not true. Like, you're not sitting there thinking,
she's speaking directly to you.
I'm writing to Cheryl.
Dear Cheryl.
Yeah. I wonder what Cheryl as an investor is wondering about today. But it does feel a little bit like that. Like, I'm curious, when you think about the things that the average investor in Australia should or needs to, or like likely should be across, like what are some of the things that actually, do you think about us at all, is my first question. And please let that answer be yes. And my second question is like, what are some of the things that come to mind as you think about that audience and like some of the stories that you've chosen under that kind of headline?
Yeah, so look, I definitely do. I think, especially because we're a subscription business, like how can I add value to an investor? And particularly because we, have quite a small investment community. There's a lot that kind of people chat amongst themselves anyway. There's very rarely something you got to report on that someone hasn't got a whiff of somewhere. The way I've put it to people is, if I can capture the conversations that I know the industry is having and give it wider awareness, the better the industry is going to be. So I know everyone's talking about that internally, or might be across it internally. The way I see that I help the ecosystem is give other people who aren't in the ecosystem insight into how the ecosystem is thinking. And that's how I think it'll be stronger. There's still a lot of kind of poo-pooing the industry in some quarters that I think we've well and truly gone past. It's not a novel cottage industry on the sidelines.
I'd hope not, with tech being like the third largest GDP.
I know, but it still surprises me how it's kind of treated a little bit like that still. And some of that speaks to the conservative nature of your average reader in Australia, business reader in Australia. So other publications are speaking to that audience. But we don't just have startups as an audience. We've got a really well-read political section. We cover banking, we cover everything. So those are also decision makers in the country. We have really big readership in Canberra. So, when I'm writing about startups, I'm hoping that they're reading it, and their insight is into how startups and VCs are thinking. And I think that's how, the ecosystem will be elevated. I was asked on a panel like once, like, you know, what do you do to help founders? And I was like, well, it's not my job to help founders, but I do see it my job to hold the ecosystem up. And that includes making it accountable.
I was going to say, I think a lot of what you do is holding the ecosystem accountable.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think you do better than any other news source that I read. Is when I read Capital Brief, I'm like, this is something that I know is coming from a place of you've researched this and you standing behind these opinions. It's not just, oh, so-and-so heard from so-and-so.
Yeah. I mean, look, I hope so. It's good to have that feedback. I mean, you know, it's not like I think the industry is utopian and without questions. None of us do. I mean, realistically, none of us do. It's a hard thing. And the people doing this, they're not elected leaders that we, you know, voting on good people or not. But sometimes I feel like they're treated like them.
Maybe they should be. You get to be a journalist. Vote.
I think that one of the things that strikes me about the way that Capital Brief writes, and you in particular, is that kind of interdisciplinary piece that you bring to it, right? Like you've had a lot of those experiences, and especially for investors, you know, and something for this podcast we spend a lot of time thinking about is like, how do we bring in a wider variety of perspectives so that we can be excellent at decision making because we have a wider set of information. And so when you're thinking about like the threads you pull in or the way that you think about, you know, especially from the political side, right? The political environment in which we're operating is so impactful on the businesses that we're operating, or, you know, and vice versa. Right. The fact that there isn't yet a deep understanding of the startup ecosystem in Canberra, I think, is a real risk for the Australian ecosystem. I think we see it most acutely in the sophisticated investor test and the dialogue around that at the moment. Right. It's like they are pursuing an agenda to protect pensioners, which I think is very important and admirable. It's just a kind of the impact on the Australian startup ecosystem is kind of not really understood.
At the expense of.
Yeah. At, you know, the potential of creating another crop of incredible companies like Canva, like Atlassian and similar. And so I think maybe just from your perspective, how do you go about curating your information set, making sure that you're across a wide variety of content so that you can find those interdisciplinary insights, so that you can bring the variety of perspectives to the table when you're writing them? Because I think it's a really useful skill set in everything that you do, and especially in investing.
Yeah, look, the one thing, and it's such a basic thing, but I always make that last phone call. You always think you've got enough. And then I'm always like, I'm just going to make one more phone call because I'm interested in chatting to people. So not everyone I speak to is, you know, for an interview. I have a lot of people I'll just ring to to say, hey, this is what I've been thinking. What do you think? And every time I've done that, I've learned something. You know, I have this really privileged position of speaking to so many people into the ecosystem day in, day out. And I always push back on journalists who are like, well, I'm not the expert. And I'm like, well, actually, you're in the pole position to be the expert in this subject. You know, you speak and talk to everyone about it day in and day out. But yeah, I think just always checking in with people, light touch. I have a lot of people I ring to. I try not to ring the same people over and over again. But yeah, I think just always making that last phone call. And also I think that's sometimes where my experience in the industry plays into it. Like there's a lot of things you've seen before. So you're like, okay, I know this is an issue, or this has been an issue in the past. And, you know, the issue we wrote on last week, which was on changes to super funds and how they're going to be taxing unrealised gains. Like that's literally a fight we had a few years ago when everyone was taxed on unrealised gains and ESOPs. Yeah, I think this isn't getting as much coverage because people are assuming it's a small amount of people. But I honestly think that's going to have an impact.
I also think that's an area where a lot of people think that someone else will fix it. Oh, it like they think, oh, they couldn't possibly be that silly. Like somebody will fix this before it gets to the point of no return. And that's just not the case. Like I think we're all just a little bit, as true investors, we're all just a little bit too optimistic in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a real insight, right? Especially in Australia, I have noticed, especially in Australia versus the US, there's just this belief, because we've been so lucky for so long for a system that has like largely served you in the majority of circumstances. There's such a quick default to like, oh, someone else will fix it, largely like the government will fix it. But I actually think in startups, that's probably less, like at least the startup ecosystem in Australia, that is like not a very helpful strategy because of what we were just talking about, right? They're not going to fix it because they don't know about it. They're like not thinking about the implications.
Yeah, look, we've always had that, the industry's always had that challenge that everyone's so busy building and doing that not everyone has time to look up and talk about impact. There's been a long history of kind of like trying to educate the government on these things, but then governments change. The government is voted out, who is getting it, you're dealing with a new minister. And, I spent 2 years working in state government. And let me just say, for a startup person, it was like banging your head against a brick wall. Governments are the biggest, oldest, archaic.
I couldn't do it. I don't know how you did that.
Yeah.
Well, with a lot of deep breaths every day. But, it really was an amazing insight into government. Government is entirely about managing up. You do not do anything for below you. You do anything for above. And that is how it works. And all anyone at the top wants is jobs figures. And, and startups, they employ a lot of people, but not in the same way that other industries do. They're just not a voting, not something that's going to make someone vote for startups or not. Very few people are going to make it a reason they vote. So I think that's the challenge. Of course, we've got the Australian Tech Council who do a fantastic job, but at the same time, there is a slight conflict because they also represent big tech. And big tech and startups, particularly lately, have come into conflict, especially with something like AI. Big tech wants regulation. Startups don't want that. Big tech wants regulation because it's going to, defend their territory. So, it's complex. But to me also, as a journalist, it's kind of what makes the industry interesting. Like there's no shortage of things happening.
Yeah, there certainly is not.
For sure. And I think the other thing is that you seem to take quite a international approach to your perspective. I know you've lived overseas, you lived in the US and you've lived here. How do you think about curating your information networks both here and internationally so you can kind of bring those perspectives?
I think we definitely have to do it because I think right now Australia is in a really strong position. And the reason is because our industry hasn't been nuked like they have in the US. I mean, I'm on a lot of, tech sites in the US. I still kind of keep up with them. People have been looking for jobs for 2 years, and not got an interview. The industry there is really, really struggling. And AI is not going to it's going to bring back some jobs, but it's also going to mean a lot more are not so relevant anymore. So I think that's important to keep in mind. But Australian startups have always done more with less. The things that US VCs are talking about right now, like get to revenue, growth at all costs is not a thing. We want to see efficiency. That has literally been how all Australian startups have built until now. And so it's interesting to see that the kind of conversation shift in the US, and you two have both been there too, to those sort of things that have always been, said here. So I think naturally Australian startups have an ability to adapt to what I think is going to be the new reality for a while. I don't think, we've all talked about this, this slump. I think it's going to be a little bit more than a slump. It's going to be here for a while.
Both of our theses, like Maxine and I's thesis in general with investing, is around that concept that we believe that Australia punches above its weight and is in a much more effective position for growing and winning in a lot of spaces. Not every space, but I think winning in a lot of spaces as the US faces a much more challenging environment. That's crazy to me that you have people in tech that are searching for that long for jobs when I don't think I know anyone in tech who has been out of a job for longer than 3 months. And I know a lot of people in tech.
Yeah, no, I think it's pretty brutal. I think there is a rebound. There certainly is a rebound. But, I do speak to investors overseas. I really enjoy that perspective. And it's also good to see how Australia's kind of, reflected back. I don't see the slump as a bad thing. I don't think it's like this. It's just the reality.
It's a correction.
It's got almost nothing to do with Australia. That's the other thing. It's all got to do with international factors. a lot of this post-COVID, the fact that, money was free at a time. This is just the reality. It's not a reflection, all these headlines about startups being written down to zero. I'm like, well, us in every freaking country. Like, this is not, when you zoom out, Australia's actually in a very strong position. And I think we produce the kind of founders that international investors are looking at right now.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think from what I've seen in the US, it does seem to be rebounding pretty strongly. Actually, pretty much the whole, since 2019, it seems to me that Australia seems to lag the US market from a sentiment perspective by about 6 months. And so when the US was, locking down and freaking out about, what would happen to the market, Australia was kind of yeah, borders are closed, but internally we're sweet, And then now it really seems like sentiment is lagging. I saw in PitchBook's data, they just published their Q1 data, and the average seed stage valuation is now the highest it's ever been.
Is that for AI companies?
That's averaged across the ecosystem. So
Okay.
I think my thesis would be it's being dragged up by AI valuations at seed stage. I also think that both of those things can exist, right?
Yes.
You can have companies that are raising a very large amount of capital on average, but they're not necessarily needing to hire as many people.
Yeah.
A la I think it's Telegram has 30 people and they're, unicorn in size. I think we're stepping into an era where we have companies with, significantly less headcount, and that those two correlated to revenue. It's not going to be as tight a correlation to revenue. My thesis is that actually this is based on data that Benchmark put together, what happened in the ecosystems when they have recovered after corrections in the past. I think 2008 and more recently is it's kind of the sawtooth dynamic, right? Risk appetite rebuilds in the ecosystem at a pretty linear, fairly slow pace over the course of, across those eras, anywhere between 7 and 15 years. And then it kind of builds up and then it comes off really quickly in a correction event.
Yeah.
So I totally agree. I don't think 24, 25, even 26, we're going to start seeing really fast-paced, frothy market again. That risk appetite, that liquidity is going to come through slowly and it'll rebuild over time. But I think this is the amazing thing about the Australian ecosystem, right? We are so well placed in that circumstance. We are a very rich country.
Yeah.
We have a lot of people who are just starting to learn about the startup ecosystem, and just starting to learn about venture capital as a ecosystem, and are starting to get curious. We have, a whole bunch of second generation kind of alumni coming out of some of the best companies in the world. Yeah, actually, I have heard, and I haven't fact checked this, but I've heard that Australia is one of the only countries in the world that has a startup ecosystem where there are 3 companies that are over $10 billion in enterprise value.
Oh, really? I don't know.
I think that's right. I was talking to somebody from the UK the other day, and they were like, the UK has none.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it could be true. Yeah, it could be true. I think the other thing that has happened, though, in the last couple of years is that it's also built stronger startups.
Yeah.
A lot of founders have had to build better companies because they weren't going to make it. They couldn't go back to market for funding. And so we've even got better at that kind of efficiency. So I think none of this is bad. And startups ultimately is, learning how to work with the things that are thrown your way. And these are just, things that have been thrown, the industry's way, and it manages to dodge them all and, keep going. I don't think it's bad news. I do think it's, and everything has to be put into the context of what's happening globally. And the other thing is, I've been going to startup conferences for as long as they've existed. And now when I go, I don't know the majority of people there. It's just this new generation of interest. And I do think there's something generational in, I was in my early 30s when I did a startup, and I was kind of seen as kind of crazy and this heretic journalist who was talking about how startups are going to interfere with the news business. I was honestly kind of seen that way. And we're now, people just, it's almost what they want. It's the end goal. They don't want to go and work at PwC. They don't want to work for a law firm. Those aren't the big things that people are aiming for. They want to build something. and they love that idea of independence, and they really value that. And I think, that's also something I kind of see more and more happening. Most people are sitting at a desk job and thinking, how do I not do this?
Yeah, absolutely.
The same is true for investing as well. Like I've never seen more interest in angel investing, in early stage investing, in people wanting to deploy capital to those businesses, because again, it's the same thing. They're sitting at a desk thinking, I don't want to give up my day job, but I want to participate in this ecosystem, and it's exciting and it's fun, and I want to learn something and also invest in my future. So like that principle I think applies across the board for both starting a company as well as investing. Like the number of people that they're coming through and like asking to get educated and investing in this asset class still astounds me.
It's totally incredible.
My thesis on this is the housing crisis is actually fueling interest in this thing, because a lot of young people will never be able to afford a house, and they're looking for ways to grow capital.
Yeah, they tell me that all the time.
Like, okay, I'm not going to make money on buying a house. Where am I going to make money? And, they can't get into the housing market. So, in some ways, the housing crisis is kind of a good thing. But, it's also why I think a lot of them invest in crypto too. It's just that appetite for like, I need to make money somehow because my wage is not going to do it. It's intertwined, but I do think they're, genuine. And also along with that, I think COVID also, everyone sat down and thought, what do I actually want to do with my life? When you're stuck in a room doing the same thing every day, you really question, like, is this
the thing I want to do every day?
Yeah, totally.
Is this the thing I want to do every day?
From bed to desk to couch to bed to no.
Hard pass.
Yeah, so I think, there's a lot of really strong signals as to why this industry will take off and only get better and stronger. We've also got really strong learnings on what works and what doesn't.
Absolutely. When you, I feel like you are fully integrated into quite a few different ecosystems, right? Like, as you said, you've worked in government, you also cover politics, you've been kind of deeply exposed to startups, you cover the markets, banking, like the more kind of traditional markets. What do you notice are the biggest deltas between the kind of echo chamber of the startup ecosystem and the echo chamber of politics and the echo chamber of, the more conservative markets? Like, what are the things that you hear on either sides of those fences that you're just like, how do you guys see the world so differently?
Look, fundamentally, it comes down to risk appetite. There are two kinds of people. There are those who are willing to take a risk and those who just aren't. And I think fundamentally, Australia is a risk-averse country, but also we've never really had to take risks because it's, that whole idea of a lucky country, I think, has, lacked a lot of motivation to do better and be better because things have been so good in itself. That's a bit of an out there thesis, but I do think that's sort of true in some regards. I don't really agree that Australia has a tall poppy syndrome. I know we still kind of rule that out as an excuse. At times like, well, they're just bashing people because that's Australia and it's tall poppy syndrome. I think, culturally Americans are much more bullish and much more, they're willing to put their dreams out there and kind of, just say it all and be really gung-ho about stuff. And I think we could learn a little bit from that. Let someone have their dreams. And you know what? Let them fail at it too. But, we shouldn't just cut people down. But yeah, fundamentally the difference between, I think, traditional markets and startups is really around risk appetite. And interestingly in Australia, because super has underpinned so much of startup VC, I think there's going to be a little bit of tension play out in the next year. I think that's going to be a real test to just how willing to take risks VC is, super is. I think we're already starting to see a little bit of friction play out in that one.
For sure.
The government has brought in new rules. They've already brought in new rules around, super has to have certain returns or they don't get other things. And basically they're telling super, stay in the safe lanes. So, yeah, I think it comes down to risk. I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Absolutely, yeah. I also think Rain, I think most recently was quite public about his perspective on this like push for Australian venture to take more risks, right? Like I think I'll 100% agree with you that Australian venture as an ecosystem is more conservative than US venture as an ecosystem. And there's lots of, especially for early stage companies, there's lots of consternation about the fact that Australian venture just like is less comfortable to go earlier, right? Hence us being the first pre-seed fund, right? Or specialist pre-seed fund. Yeah. And the way that they go earlier, like the way that they support you, the way they get behind you, but also angel investors and et cetera. And Ray made a really good point, which was like, hey, everyone, like these fund managers are on fund one. Like they haven't yet paid back fund one. And so a lot of these early fund managers, they still have to prove to their LPs who are more risk averse, like that there's actually value here. So they can't start doing a whole bunch of things that's like things that are perceived to be creative or things that are perceived to be, you know, extra risky on top of the like base risk of the asset class, because the LPs don't understand it. And as you said, for the bigger funds who have super investing in them, they're kind of like structurally prohibited from doing that or like disincentivized from doing that. I think it is a very interesting thought exercise to think about, well, how does that compound over time, right? Like if your biggest backers are, you know, having to reprice constantly because pensions are coming in, if they're having to, you know, comply with APRA's requirements that requires them to be structurally less risk comfortable for all the right reasons. But like, what does that do to venture as an ecosystem, especially compared to the US, where like one of, you know, the biggest backers and definitely the big institutions that were first to come into the space were endowment funds, right? The like fundamentals of those endowment funds, they are about, you know, building wealth for big universities that don't have constant repricing. They can think extremely long term, et cetera, et cetera. It's just like they're structurally very different things. Yeah. And I think understanding that as investors and what that does to the incentives, I think is actually, I think a little bit concerning for me, because I think about the earlier stage, like if we're risk off, like what does that mean our next generation of companies will look like? For example, I was just in Perth, and if you measured the most valuable startup, like the cities that have produced the most valuable companies in Australia in aggregate, Perth would still be the biggest because of Canva. But everyone was saying essentially none of the distributed wealth back from this round of secondaries from Canva came to Perth because no one was invested in them, even though that's where Cliff and Mel started. Yeah. And that, I think, also plays out at the national level, where we don't have, you know, early exposure to some of our biggest success stories. We don't give them a running start, right? Like the fact that Mel and Cliff were able to build Canva kind of in spite of the Australian ecosystem as opposed to because of it, I think it would be a huge tragedy if we replicated that into the next generation and kind of put drag suits on our startups so that they have to kind of play from behind relative to the international stage. But increasingly, it looks like we're making decisions that accidentally are doing that.
Yeah, there's lack of differentiation definitely amongst early stage VC. We still hear the same thesis almost from everyone. I do think that is an issue. You know, we still talk about pattern recognition and, you know, we still have an obsession with SaaS. I do think there is starting to be a narrative that is slightly different, and that's around deep tech, which Australia has always had as an advantage. Now, the costs of that have always been prohibitive to VC, but they're coming down rapidly. I also think there's only so many SaaS. Think of a SaaS product that has not been solved, or an issue you could solve with SaaS. They've almost all been solved, and how many more of them do we need? Not a lot. We can probably improve them with AI. So I do think we will see this shift, and I think it will come down to cost, because, you know, up until this stage, deep tech has not entirely made sense for VC. But I do think there will be a shift in that. And I also think we're getting to the stage where there does start to be room for VCs with a strong differentiated thesis. I don't know if you've had the deal flow to do that before, but I'd love to see that start to happen. To me, that's a real signal of maturity in the market.
Yeah.
I actually met Mel and Cliff in Perth actually when they had their first. They came to some of the first meetups we had. But they started Canva in Sydney.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of people associate Canva with Sydney, not Perth, and unfortunately, because, you know, Perth means some more wins for sure.
I know. Well, not much gets associated with Perth. Perth actually had one of the most. It had one of the original kind of. I can't even remember what it was called, but prior to startups being a thing, there was the Web Industry Association, I think it was called. That came out of Perth, and a lot of people from there kind of went on to work in startups, because we're talking about the web industry, which. God, it sounds like someone's saying information superhighway now. Yes, the web industry.
It's just such an old school way of talking about the internet. The web industry.
Yeah, the web industry. Maybe AI industry will sound the same. Yeah,
maybe it will. Like 20 years from now, it'll be like the AI industry.
Yeah, I mean, AI is. It's not a.
No, it's horizontal and vertical.
Industry. It's horizontal. Yeah, I know when I worked in government, they'd always say to me, well, the government wants to back AI. And I'm like, that's tech. Like, it doesn't exist on its own. You know, what is AI going to do?
Could you call the AI and tell them we want to back the AI?
Yes, could you call
them?
I don't know if they had this idea of a big computer that had all the answers to the world's problems. I was like, this is not a Douglas Adams novel. You know, I don't know. But yeah, I think more differentiation. And obviously, you know, the hard thing is you need one win to tell a story. You just need that first win. You know, Canva is such a huge success compared to the other success stories. Really just dwarfs everything.
Yeah.
But I guess it's a good problem to have. But, you know, Canva is, I think it's 10 times the value of our next biggest startup, which is Airwallet.
It is huge, but I mean, Atlassian also is huge.
Atlassian was huge, but it wasn't backed. There was no flow through back to Australia. But it also, Atlassian was what made Australian investors sit up and go, well, we don't want to miss out on this again.
Totally. I hope that the same dynamic happens with Canva and their wallets.
Yeah, and look, I do think people still say like, oh, we don't want to miss the next Canva. I don't think the next Canva is going to look like Canva.
No.
I actually think, I'll make a bold prediction. I think our next Canva is going to be in deep tech.
All right.
You heard it here first, guys. Spicy.
Yeah, spicy. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Bronwen.
This has just been the best. I feel like we could keep doing this.
Awesome. Well, thank you. That was fun.
It's been amazing.
Thanks so much.
The Startup Retro is a new podcast from the team behind Overnight Success.
A weekly show where we help you level up on the Australian startup ecosystem by giving you an insider's view on Aussie startups and venture capital. I'm Will Richards.
And I'm Gemma Clancy.
At OS, we curate the most important news and announcements across the ecosystem and explain a bit of useful context behind them.
The Startup Retro podcast will follow a format familiar to our readers of the weekly newsletter, but offer an opportunity for much more discussion.
So, if you want to keep your finger on the pulse of all things happening Aussie startups and venture capital, start your week by listening to the Startup Retro. New episodes every Monday, starting the 1st of July.
The Startup Retro is brought to you by Day One, the podcast network for founders, operators, and investors.